Hello, welcome to the video. My name is Mike, and I tend to talk about media theory and try to put contemporary media into context so that we have a better understanding of how it affects our lives, what our relationship with media is. And this time around, wow, what a mess. Velma, a new HBO exclusive adult animation program, is a giant mess. The show itself is a mess, and the reception to the show thus far, based on 2 episodes, I will note, has been a disaster. And that's not me trying to be, like, oh, everything's extreme on the internet, everything's a disaster, everything's a triumph. No, like, this has actually been quite a disaster in terms of critical and viewer response to the show. And notably, the show has quite a bit of political content, we could argue, or at least content relevant to various social issues. And typically, if that kind of stuff is done well, it will make people upset based on their own alignment with the messaging of the show itself. If they disagree with that messaging, they'll probably hate it. If they agree with that messaging, they'll probably like it. In this case, everybody is upset. In this case, just about everybody, regardless of their sort of political affiliation or whether they tend to generally lean left or right when it comes to all these social issues, all of these people have come across the aisle to shake hands and say, wow, Velma is bad. Velma does a bad job of trying to say whatever it's trying to say and trying to do whatever it's trying to do. I want to stick on that idea, on those particular phrases, for a little while here, because so much of this show, again, we only have 2 episodes so far, but based on what we do have, it's such a mystery to me what the actual goals were at the outset for the team behind the show. A lot of people have chosen to point to Mindy Kaling specifically because she's EP, she voices Velma. I don't know if she also has the creator credit on the show. She's a very prominent public portion of the team, but I always like to reiterate that any piece of entertainment, anything from a big studio that gets distributed on a big streaming service, has a large team of people. And the end result, the sum total of what we actually get to watch in the end, is the result of extensive collaboration. And maybe the collaboration here was the issue. I can only guess, obviously, but I kind of feel like the vision just wasn't there. I don't feel a strong sense of what it was going for. And that's such a strange aspect of this whole thing, because the show is very aggressive in its attempts at messaging. It is very aggressive in its approach to representation and diversity among the cast. It's trying really hard, or at least it appears like it's trying very hard, but in reality, it's kind of difficult to decipher what it's actually trying to do and whether or not it is succeeding with regards to those goals. So before we get any deeper, this is without a script, by the way. I just had to I'm just gonna share some thoughts and be on my way. I have to note that some of the anger leveraged at the show here is sort of that typical right-leaning internet stuff where people are just upset that it contains all this, so-called woke content. I feel like even that term is on the way out at this point. It's just so overused and amorphous at this point. But so many people in that camp are just like, I hate any time you recast a white character as another ethnicity. I hate any time you try to have, the characters be different in any way, or have them try to address modern topics and all that kind of stuff. It seems to just bother these people to no end if there are any changes made to the original property, and if those changes are specifically viewed as being woke or progressive in some way, and they feel like they're, that type of messaging is being forced on them, even though just diversity of representation with regards to gender and sexual orientation and ethnicity have nothing inherently to do with messaging. It's just a basic thing. It's trying to represent the human race in a more balanced fashion. But anyway, long story short, none of those aspects bother me. I don't really care that there have been changes to the ethnicity of many of the characters. I don't really care that the main mystery gang cast here, who have not become the mystery gang at all, I don't care that they have different personalities than what we've seen in the past. I don't care that they have different living situations. I don't care that they've been transported to the modern age. I don't mind any of that on its own. However, on the level of storytelling and adaptation is something I've been talking about quite a bit here on the channel recently, is that after a certain point, a lot of the changes made, not in terms of representation, ethnicity, etc., but just in terms of who the characters are and what they're doing across these different episodes, they're so different from the original Scooby-Doo property, namely that only Velma seems to be the one who's even vaguely interested in solving mysteries. Hopefully that will change over the course of the season, but so far it's just Velma who cares about solving mysteries, and even then, it's a thing she does sometimes. It's like a hobby almost, and most of the time she seems much more concerned with yelling at people about everything, because she hates everyone, and she hates television tropes, and she hates detective shows, and she hates her peers, her classmates. When there's so little connection to the original core of Scooby-Doo as a franchise, which was never a good franchise to begin with, it's just cheap junk that was churned out back in the day for as little money as possible. Why? Why is this a Scooby-Doo related property in the first place? Like, what is the value we're getting out of this particular take on these characters when there's just no real connection? I have to guess that it got the green light because it's related to the Scooby-Doo property in some way, which is an IP that Warner Brothers or Warner Discovery just happens to own, and of course any recognizable property has to be milked for all it's worth, especially if it hasn't been too successful so far. They just have to keep trying again and again and again, although there's a contradiction here because there's a sequel to Scoob that was ready to be released, and then Warner just axed that project in the face. But this, and this is something I'll return to later, this is a project they decided to go through with. This is a project that Warner Discovery thought would just be excellent, that it would really turn in some numbers for them, really get things going, revitalize this property. Boy, oh boy, has that decision just completely blown up in their face. At least so far, people are not on board with this adaptation. So very little connection to the original property. It almost feels incidental. It almost feels like they had plans for a completely original show about like a sort of combative, queer female detective character in high school. And then they just had to shoehorn that idea into the Scooby-Doo property. And even that was clearly a very poor fit. It just feels so confused. It feels so without anchoring or grounding of any kind. It's an incredibly strange situation. And in particular, it really feels to me like the show is struggling to figure out who it's supposed to be talking to in terms of like target audience. So unless you're making a super broad, middle-of-the-road show or movie, whatever, that's going to appeal to a large variety of people, most of the time you want to have a clear idea of who the target audience is. It'll probably be like a specific age range or demographic, right? So maybe like 18 to 24-year-olds or wider, 18 to 34-year-olds, something like that. This is all just part of the marketing process, and it can be a big part of developing shows as well. And here, I have no idea who Velma, as a project, thought that it needed to be addressing itself to. It doesn't seem to know who it's for. And that really comes down to a lot of the dialogue in this show. I already touched on the fact that Velma's very angry and hates most people and things. And like, I don't hate that take on the character at all. Like, that's fine. And especially in a contemporary context, a character like her in a situation like hers would be totally justified in feeling that way. But instead, I don't think it plays well, for one thing. The performance and the writing, they do not come together to create a character that is in any way likable. But just the number of times that the show tries to make very meta comments on like how shows like this tend to go and what adult animation tends to be like. The first 5 minutes of the show is jam-packed with that type of commentary. To me, it seems like those kinds of comments would be most effective if the show thought that it was speaking to a very middle-of-the-road or even right-leaning internet audience. It's a form of like speaking truth to power or something like that, to be like, hey, these people may not be aware of certain tropes and certain standards that are harmful in terms of depictions of characters. So we're going to inform them. We are going to provide a service by saying some telling them the tough stuff that they don't want to hear. Okay. However, I don't really know whether that is the audience of the show in the first place. It's certainly not the audience that's going to be able to maintain over time, because everything I've seen from that camp of the internet has been extremely negative. So I don't think they're going to stick it out with this one. So instead, it would be more likely that you're speaking to a more left-leaning audience, still a relatively young audience, but an audience that is generally supportive of diversity and representation initiatives. They want to see more positive representation and just more representation in general. They are aware of many TV tropes and vehemently against those tropes and how they tend to function. But if that's the audience you're speaking to, so much of this meta commentary is stuff that we've heard a million times before. And I say that as someone who counts myself among that group. I mean, certainly more than any right-leaning internet group. Also, by the way, this has been something we've been trying to do in new media for a very long time, arguably for decades.
It's not progressive if you're progressing to the place where we already fucking are, genius!
And so, in that case, the show's approach to this material, the aggressive fashion in which they introduce and comment on a lot of these topics, feels basic. It feels basic in comparison to other efforts we've gotten on this front from other creators. It feels basic in terms of the commentary that it's offering in the first place. It never actually offers any insights that are really that valuable, that are really that interesting or new. It's mostly parroting stuff that a lot of us have been saying for a long time. So, to sum up here, both of these audiences, relatively young, very online audiences with very different perspectives on representation, diversity, progress in media, have been underserved by the dialogue here. The scripts are not doing anything for any of us. And that definitely contributes to that very unified hatred of the show that I touched on earlier. What does it think it's offering? What does it really think it is giving to anyone of any demographic? It goes right back to that initial feeling. I just don't think the vision was there. I don't know if there was a clear vision at all in the first place, or if there was and it just got muddled and watered down over time. But so much of it in execution just feels like, oh, well, this is what we do now. This is what like a contemporary adult animation show is supposed to do. It's supposed to be meta constantly. It's supposed to cast people that are reasonably well known, but they're not especially good voice actors. We're supposed to comment on the state of contemporary media. It all falls flat, and it's a little bit hilarious to me just because at times it does feel like the show is trying really hard, and none of it is sticking. None of it is sticking, and you know what? This even extends to the way that the show is structured. One of my least favorite aspects of the show by far is how it is deciding to handle mysteries. And I use the word mysteries generously because really the show has decided, or at least it appears this way so far, that the entire season is going to be the process of solving one big mystery, potentially two, because Velma's mom is missing and it's a cold case and it's something that's just brought up on occasion. And I tended to forget about it in action. But basically, there's one big, giant whodunit mystery happening at the high school. And this is something I've talked about before, but there's a pretty big distinction between major broadcast shows of like the early 2000s and before, and then major broadcast shows, and especially prestige television from that point onward, is that there's been a huge bias in more recent years towards storytelling that's stretched out over an entire season or even multiple seasons. So you're not getting one-off episodic stories. You're not getting a story that starts, develops, and ends within a single episode. You may have aspects of a larger story that resolve in some way during a single episode, but for the most part, the whole thing is stretched out, and you end up with the structure where the end of every single episode is a teaser, basically a cliffhanger for the next portion of the story. Breaking Bad, Mad Men early on, on. Gosh, Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, basically every major dramatic television show, sci-fi television show, more recently has had this structure, and previously there were plenty of shows that delivered episodic stories. The example I usually go to is the old Star Trek shows, specifically DS9 or TNG, where there is a self-contained story to basically every episode. There are some two-parters and there are some stories that stretch out over the course of several episodes, but for the most part, you are getting a nice, satisfying story arc within a single episode. And in my mind, that would have 100% been the way to go with a Scooby-Doo show. The point of her character, relevant to the Scooby-Doo series, is that she's really good at solving mysteries. And in the first episode, she kind of solves a mini mystery that's just a giant letdown. But otherwise, it's just the show is just pointing us to these much larger mysteries that are going to take much longer to resolve. And the second episode, there's basically no mystery, whodunit, anything. It's just a series of smaller little things. And there's something that Velma has to do as like step 0.1 to solving the larger mystery. And she barely achieves that. And then it's over. And I'm like, what, why? There are no cliffhangers here to inspire us to keep watching, and that's especially crucial because of the release schedule that HBO has decided on for this show, where they're releasing episodes on a weekly basis instead of giving us the whole season in one go and allowing for binge watching. I do not understand, and this is where I will touch on the larger recent issues a lot of us have had, specifically with the HBO Max portion of the Warner Discovery conglomerate empire. My goodness, they axed all these shows and properties and things that we were looking forward to that were basically finished in post-production. I mentioned that Scoob sequel from before. They just straight up removed a bunch of television shows that you can no longer access anywhere. The big one is Summer Camp Island, of course, are close enough. They're just gone because they didn't want to pay residuals for those shows. But meanwhile, here, Velma, they were more than willing to fork over the cash for Velma to get this thing developed and produced and released and distributed. And here it is, and it's such junk, at least so far. Who knows? Anything could happen. I guess if everything completely turns around, it might turn into a show that has a dedicated fan base. For the moment, it just comes across as junk. This was the bet. This was the one that they really thought would do it. And that's so funny to me. That is just such a blight on the already blotchy, crumpled up record that HBO has in terms of programming decisions since the merger acquisition deal. Every part of it is bad. Every single part of it is a questionable decision that we're now seeing resulted in something that just doesn't work. And that is rare. That is incredibly rare, to the point where this is almost something to be celebrated, just as an anomaly. You took something that could have been quite fun, characters that people tend to like, a character in Velma herself who has been coded as queer in plenty of previous iterations. You somehow find a way to mess that up to make most of its characters unlikable. I know that I'm just some guy standing on the sidelines, but I have to say that I have enjoyed this. I have enjoyed the response to the show thus far. I have enjoyed, at the very least, attempting to understand why these decisions were made. I still don't have answers on that front, but woof. What a load of junk. Just a terrible, terrible sign of what this giant company thinks are good decisions. It just kind of baffles me. It's sad and exciting at the very same time. And I just wanted to share some thoughts, but I hope that I've said something that resonated with you. If you're interested in hearing more of my comments on media theory, recent releases, and all that kind of stuff, and even our relationship with various communities in YouTube, please feel free to stick around the channel. It would mean a lot to me if you went ahead and subscribed to the channel, all that kind of YouTube-y stuff. But for the moment, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.